Hi, I'm Seamless, and today it is time for the third part of the making of the R is Silent. This is going to be about mixing and mastering and mixing. Now, um, the way that I mastered this track, the way that I mix this track, is the same way I master and mix all my tracks, which is to say that I set up my mastering chain as soon as possible, and then I continue to make the track and mix it with the mastering chain on. And it's kind of interesting because normally, like the way you would think that if I'm doing this, so this is me trying to do something silly that ended up not working out. Don't worry about that. But you would think that there's no way that I could make a mastering chain early on, even if I made, just this part, which is what I did. I made the first sort of phrase. I made the bass. I made the drums. I put them together, and then I mixed and mastered this column of sound together as if it were finished. But then you make changes later to the mix. You alter things, and then you add new stuff. Then like how do you know that they're all going to fit with what master chain you have? Can the master chain that you make at this stage be anything other than placeholder? And I assume that it would be, actually. Like, I assume that, yeah, what I'm doing is placeholder. It's just so that I know kind of how it feels, because the final product, while I'll perfect it a little bit, isn't going to differ too much from the feel and the sound wise. The thing is, though, is that even if it is placeholder, even if the mix, the settings that you use in whatever your master chain is, are something that you just threw together for whatever part of this here, the whole idea is that you're making mixing decisions with it on, so that when you change the levels of something and you change the EQing of something, it is you'll immediately know what its behavior will represent before under compression and whatever else you're doing, that kind of thing. As a result, what'll end up happening is that I don't really ever listen to what this tracks like these sound like without mastering on it. As it turns out, that's what it sounds like. I turn it down to keep the peaks below 0 dB there. But what that illustrates is that sort of quality, that bit where the drums are way louder than everything else, that's punchy as hell, and that kind of thing, that's essentially the kind of pre-master you'd want to make for this kind of music anyway. But I arrived at doing that without actually making a pre-master. And the thing about that is, like, you can still do the whole pre-master master idea. It's just that when you make the pre-master, the whole idea is you're trying to make it sound like your idea of the song as best you can without master compression. And the thing about that is that for this style of music, you really can't do that. It's because the quality, the texture, the feeling of all these things are really the result of like stylistic application of compression on the master. You can kind of fudge it with like side chaining and automation on volume and stuff like that to make it feel like it's being compressed, but it's still, at the end of the day, not going to have that sort of zazz that master effects and compression gives a track like this. As a result, you make a mix that gets you kind of close like that, nice, well balanced, even sounding, pretty good sounding mix, and then that mix that you make there is not going to behave well with this kind of compression. And then you make changes. You make changes to your mix. You make things louder, make things quieter, and then eventually you end up with this kind of mix with the drums wildly louder than everything else, with certain different instruments behaving differently and wildly, and essentially not a good mix. Like, the whole idea of the pre-master in certain genres is that, like, it's supposed to sound like it could be fine by itself. That, like, really the only thing wrong with it is that it's not very loud. And for a whole lot of genres, that's totally fine. But for this really hard-hitting, banger-esque, super compressed, ultra EDM, dubby, neuro heaviness, it's not gonna fly. So this is why I advocate for having the master chain on while you're doing it. And the whole point of saying that is that, like, even if your master chain is totally placeholder, the fact that you're making your mixing decisions based on that means that you're going to make a mix that's going to react better with that mastering setting, way better than you could ever have made a mastering setting react with a mix that you've completed before. And you essentially end up at where you'd be if you were doing the revisions of your mix with a mastering engineer a lot faster. I'm not saying you can't do that, because people do, and they make totally dope things. Like 85's track Snowblind, I was fortunate enough to actually hear what that sounded like before mastering, and it sounded kind of like that, just and it's a little bit different. Obviously, it's a different style from what this is, but the principles were still the same, and the mastering engineer, Recursion, it was able to work with that like pretty flawlessly, and it worked out rather well. It's just that the pre-master had 15 revisions on it, so it took kind of a while to get there. And if you're not into taking forever to get there, then what I'm doing at the moment, obviously works for at least my sensibilities. Now, so like I said, I made the first bit, and then I actually made the master chain, and the chain itself is a bit weird. Around and now, when I made this track was when I just sort of figured out that the bass and the kick, and the bass and the sub and the kick had to have a particular relationship to it. And this little curve that I created here in the Maximus's graph is essentially describing this relationship, where the bass level kind of needs to stick at a certain level, and then the kick level needs to be pretty higher. So that this represents a consistent level of bass, and this represents a consistently higher level of kick. It doesn't necessarily matter that I chose minus 6 dB and 0 dB, just that there is a consistent shelf for the common bass, the sub of whatever basses you're having, and then a consistently higher shelf for the actual sub of the kick. This is dynamic range 101. It's the idea that because the kick is considerably louder in dynamics from the consistency of the shelf and the bass, we perceive that difference, not so much the fact that at whatever level it is, we just perceive that it's different, and that gets us, punchier ideas. Of course, this was also before I really started to grasp the idea that a separate sub in this sort of stuff is really very important, and with all the resampling and all the filtering and compressing and all that, the sub in this track is pretty gnarly. The whole point of doing this is basically to kind of save the sub. You see the beige here. This is the original input signal. It's everywhere. It's all over the place. It's not consistent at all. The new version of it is still pretty inconsistent, but it's way more consistent than it was before. And so this kind of saves it. It also helps that there's a ton of side chaining on the kick, and there's also a ton of side chaining on the snare, and the rhythm and the sort of the style of the bass can survive this. If this were like a real straight hitting, like Datsik Firepower style, like solidly running bass, this would be terribly bad. But I've never actually looked at what like Billane's tracks look like, but I have to imagine they would actually look something like this. Drum and bass and neuro genres have way different sort of bass profiles than your average kind of stuff, especially the hardcore neuro stuff. Because there are genres of drum and bass, like liquid drum and bass will be pretty consistently. They have a sub in there on top of like mid-range basses and stuff like that. So this would be trying to save that and to kind of make a semblance of that happening and going on in the track. And some of my other tracks on the EP, I actually did have a separate sub, but I was able to more directly create this profile without actually needing to do this shape, because it just happened that way based on the signal that was being set to it. The mids and the highs are basically set to taste. It's not really, it's just by ear. The point of a multi-band compressor, like the whole reason why you have a multi-band compressor, is because you want to compress everything, pretty high, or limit it anyway. You want to reduce the amount of dynamic range so that whatever part of it sounds a bit louder, because whatever you're doing is spending more time being high as opposed to spending more time having a lot of space in between the lowest peaks and the highest peaks. That's what compression is for. For a more in-depth description of what I mean by that, check out my Production Basics series on compression, and the one on mastering. Also, the one on mixing helps too. Anyway, the point of it all is that, like, if there's a giant peak in the mids, then the mids can take care of themselves without messing with the highs and the lows. So I make the splits in the multi-band compressor to represent the three most disruptive elements in any of these kinds of styles. That's the kick, the snare, and the hats. Hats aren't really disruptive. In fact, the high frequencies in general are not disruptive at all. The whole point, like the nature of high frequencies, are that they don't need to be as loud levels-wise for us to interpret them as being as loud as everything else, which means that we have a lot of headroom for high frequencies, which means you can turn them down, and you'll still be able to hear them clearly, and you'll still be able to have the impact, but they won't actually be so piercingly super loud, and you'll have a lot of headroom to work with, and you don't need to really worry about that. For mids and lows, though, we have the peaks of snares hitting. And sometimes, like, whatever mid is left in the kick, and then in the kick, we have lots of, peaking on that kind of thing, so lots of peaks to worry about. Now, master limiting. So this is a multi-band compressor. We have the three compressors and then a master single band compressor. At this point, through the multi-band compression, the hope is that we've managed to actually even out a lot of the peaking individually to the point where the resulting mix, while still pretty peaky, is not nearly as peaky as it would have been before. Now, as we see here, the purple is the original signal and the beige is the signal that's going out. It's actually extremely peaky. And I mean, look at this, peaking up almost to +9, dB. And you might be saying, "Wow, I guess that multiband didn't succeed in making it less peaky." Like, no, this is less peaky. And this kind of peaky though is actually pretty good because I'm utilizing compression with this regular ratio here. Threshold 0 dB, ratio basically 2 to 1. There's actually not a huge amount of compression. And if this were by itself, this would still be clipping like nobody's business. But I'm also utilizing soft saturation. The soft saturation is engaged by using the threshold setting here. At default, which is the 0 center, it's off. You have on one side, on the other side, and it's two different kinds of settings you can have on it. I turn it so that's just barely on one side, so that it's on, but it's super thin, so that it's limiting pretty hard with this red line here, which by default is at 0 dB. Now, what soft saturation does is it's clipping, it's distortion, but it's controlled distortion, it's algorithmic distortion. The difference between clipping and algorithmic distortion is that clipping prints physically impossible signals. Band limited still, but it's still, ridiculously high frequency and sharp, like a square wave for real. I don't know if a lot of you are actually probably too young to know and remember this, but a lot of older analog gear would actually damage speakers if you were to put out a real square wave, for real actual full-on analog, not band limited square wave. And the whole reason for that is that if you look at what a square wave is, it starts off, it goes to a point, and then it's a completely vertical line, which is, in mathematic terms, means that there's a point up here and a point down here that are technically the same point in time, but two different positions. And you cannot make a speaker do that. It will try as hard as it can, and it will result usually in bad things. We don't really have that problem today because technology is good enough that it, manages to deal with that. And this idea of band limiting I keep mentioning is that in sample rates, you have a limit as to the highest frequency that you can create. And the higher the frequency, the faster the speaker cone needs to move to produce that frequency. In this case, the highest frequency of 44.1K is half, which is 22.05. That's what's called a Nyquist limit. So with this in mind, if you clip something and it's just cutting it at a perfectly sharp angle, it's still going to play a lot of frequencies, and it's going to do an interesting job of it because not all speakers are built the same, which means that they're all going to react differently to that particular signal. This means that even if it sounds good, because people do clip their stuff to make it, as a form of mastering, and even if it does sound good to you, it is not guaranteed to sound good to everyone else. So that's not something I recommend doing. However, this is where algorithmic distortion comes in. Algorithmic distortion takes all this into account and shapes it and does it in such a way that's on purpose, where it is a more reasonable signal that speakers can actually reproduce and reliably. And that results in a sound that, if it sounds good to you, it probably also still sounds good on other things, although you should probably check. Now, why this is good and why that we have this incredibly really, really sharp transients going on here is that the reason why soft saturation works, because it's distortion. We're saying we're distorting the signal. The reason why this works is because these really big transients are really full of very high frequency content. This is a kick impulse. This is a snare impulse, that kind of thing. One or the other, right, reversed. And these signals are already full of high frequency content, and digitally, and also in analog, with different, just in general, when you distort a signal, all you're doing to it is that you're adding additional harmonic content, higher frequencies. And if it's only a little bit, then you're only adding a little bit of higher frequencies, that kind of thing. There's ways of managing it, and I might have been totally right about that, but the point being is that you do add additional higher frequencies. So if you already have all of the higher frequencies, or just a lot of high frequencies, a little bit more for an extremely short period of time, what is this? Does this measure it? Yeah, it's not measuring it. I don't actually know how fast this is, but it's freaking fast, which means that it is almost completely unnoticeable. So for mastering this track, it's actually a balancing game between how loud it is and how hard you can push it into soft saturation before it becomes bad. In the case of this track, it's pretty far. Now, I am also using actual compression because the farther that you push it beyond the threshold for soft saturation, the more additional harmonic content gets added, which means the more noticeable the distortion is. So that means it gets to be a bit bad. But because we're not going fully past it, just 1-to-1, we are using a little bit of compression. That means we're pushing it down a bit, and you're not going as far past it as we could be. And it's also true for if you have regular compression, this is straight up limiting everything. You have your limits to how far you can push it before it starts to sound bad and warbly. You, as being younger producers yourselves, usually probably have heard this a lot. And so to prevent this, we're kind of using the best of both worlds. And the benefit of soft saturation as well is that it has no time variables, no attack, no release, no decay, none of that. It happens instantaneously, which means that it's punchy. It preserves punchiness out of sounds that you're using, which is super duper important. Now in regular compression, when you're using time variables, the faster time variables, the more it'll distort, and the slower time variables, the more it'll warble. You know, you have to, again, find the balance between the two, the sweet spot for whatever it is that you're doing right at the moment, which is why mastering presets are kind of a bad idea. Unless you're making, you have a template for a track and you're just making that same track over and over again, just in different ways, chances are template and presets are not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution to what you're doing. But like this release time here that I'm doing, I'm actually automating it in the track. And I pointed this out in the last video. And what this is actually doing is that for every so often it would come in with these 808s. You might notice that's what that sounds like when it's distorted. That means I'm pushing it too far past the, there we go. See, it doesn't distort. But like, I'm automating the release time to be super high. This is because if your release time is faster than the oscillation of the waveform, that means you're going to shape the wave, otherwise known as wave shaping. If I zoom in far enough, you can actually see this happening. So right now, the release is so fast, or slow rather, when it's automated up, that you have this nice smooth line going on. But if I get rid of it, the automation that is, and we play it, you can see that now it's actually reacting pretty tightly to it. It's pretty fast. This particular moment, it doesn't look like it's it doesn't look like it's so fast that it's actually gonna damage the sound, but it would. That's the part of, if I didn't. See, that's even, I don't have, the soft saturation is not being used right now. I can just turn it off. And it's distorting that because of the, well, now I have to re-engage the automation. And now it's clean. And also not as loud as it was a minute ago. So that's why I'm automating the release time of the compression for these specific moments. It also sounds like really loud. You can see right here, here's a nice little smooth moment, and then there's a really sharp moment. The faster release time means that it more closely adheres to the waveform's oscillation, pushing it up louder, nice in there, which means that it spends more time being loud and closer to 0 dB. So the faster the release time, the louder it is. But you can get so loud that it actually distorts things. In fact, if you get rid of all the time variables, totally, then Maximus essentially turns into what the fruity wave shaper does, which I'm sure I have an instance around here somewhere. Yeah. This graph and how this works is exactly the same as this graph. It's just that the wave shaper, as an individual plugin, does not have time variables, much like soft saturation, which is pretty similar to the the algorithmic equivalent of clipping. So that's what's up with the automation. And now don't be afraid to get real specific with your mastering automation. I tend to be kind of lazy about it because I do like to have procedural solutions, which is to say a solution that takes care of all eventualities, but that's kind of rare, especially when you're trying to have sort of contrary moments and usage of negative space relatively, like what I am doing now. Because what works for really loud moments usually doesn't work for really quiet moments, which is also why during the whole intro here, I have the release time really high. This is because this is full of relatively low frequency content as a whole. The bass is being filtered. The only really high frequency content present is the drums. Everything else is smooth and low headroom and low profile. And if it were to have the application of the drop mastering applied to it, it would be noticeably bad because there's not enough just general high frequency content there to mask the badness of the mastering decisions. Now, as far as mixing everything, this track has been interesting because what I normally do is I have all the drums, and I have a drums bus, and then I compress them together. And I didn't do that for this track. I did not actually compress the drums, which is not to say compression wasn't involved with the drums, because these are the 85 samples from the Break Tweaker pack, and like, especially like these things are already pretty processed, pretty full of compression and distortion, a lot of processing in general, and they like I may have needed to use compression if they were a bit more dry, but they weren't. And it just so happened that their tone and the way they were, and like sort of the dryness of everything, like this wasn't a very smooth sounding track. It's not like it's not full of the kind of compressed wash that you expect from a lot of more like bangery tracks. This guy actually it had a little bit more dynamic range than usual in the first place. Even if it is still pretty sausagey, this sort of, it feels as though there's more punch and dynamic range than my typical track. And this is because and as a result, like I didn't need to push the drums. I just didn't need to. I have side chaining going on the hats, which, like I said before, it kind of mimics the result of when you overcompress something. Even if you're doing a pre-mastered mix without any compression on anything, if you're using side chaining to do ducking, the ducking is actually a result of an ancient mixing mistake that would happen on single band compressors when you had a loud peak in the bass that brought everything down. It ducked everything. People happen to like that effect. Now they do it on purpose with side chaining. So that's why it sounds compressed when you do that kind of thing. And even though we're not actually using compression, doing that, putting a hole in something where something else is to fit inside to reduce your headroom, or to increase your headroom rather, because nothing is not peaking higher than your average amount because you're ducking away the conflicting frequencies, that actually is still compression because you're still compressing the dynamic range of everything as a result. If I were to just play the kick and the bass together, it would add together to be so high in level. But then if I sidechain the bass to the kick so that it ducks when the kick plays, it brings down the level. We are compressing the dynamic range just without a compressor. Of course, using a sidechain input in a compressor is still using a compressor, but you know what I mean. We can do that with the volume automation. In fact, I do that nowadays with actual volume automation. It's almost like manual compression. You have to think about compression in terms of not just something you do with a compressor, but it's a product of a lot of other things, because you can still have a pretty compressed track even with just basic mixing. I've even tried to see how hard I can make everything fit together so that like the levels is brought down, the peaks are not pretty high. It's still reducing dynamic range. That's still compression. So let's put that in your brain. Put that in your brain and smoke it. As far as actual sidechaining, I have a bus where all the synths are going. It's being sidechained pretty hard. It's being ducked pretty hard as a result of sidechaining in a compressor. Lots of fun that. I also EQ'd the individual, the whole bus, which is kind of interesting. An interesting decision on my part. Now, let's talk about mixing versus sound design. So I mentioned this to a lot of my students when I talk about EQing and like how to do EQing, because one of the things that I actually do kind of agree with in terms of like professorial engineering, when they describe to you how to use an equalizer, they say two things. They say A, never boost, and B, never cut more than -6 dB. And so you might be thinking, well, how do I boost something if I want to increase something? Well, what you do is you cut everything else, and then you increase the volume. That's how you boost. And the reason why they say this is because of how most equalizers do their job. If they do it as a result of a process referred to as minimum phase. And it's called minimum phase because the way the EQs work is that they actually change the phase of certain frequencies around the point where you're creating whatever cut or boost that you're doing, so that they cancel or interfere constructively or constructively or destructively to increase or decrease whatever that frequency is around, that kind of thing. That's all. That's how filters or whatever do their job. Which is why when you whip around a filter so much that you kind of see the frequencies moving a bit, that's phase modulation, which is also how frequency modulation works, which is to say you're changing the pitch of something because you're moving the phase of it while it plays. And if you do a cut too far or a boost too far, and you move the phases too much, you get phase distortion, which is super duper subtle. It's really hard to kind of pick out. But if you did this on add 30 equalizers in your entire track, it'll add up and it'll be bad. I still kind of agree with this. However, I only agree with that in terms of mixing EQ. And you might be thinking, well, what else are you doing with EQ? Well, you're doing what I refer to as sound design EQ, which is when you're making a sound and you're going like, I'm just going to, and then, and also, and make ridiculous super profiles that like a mixing engineer will look at and cry because it just hurts their soul. And this idea, and the reason for this, the whole reason why you want to avoid phase distortion, other than adding up and sounding bad at the end of the track, is that you want the whole point of mixing. When you mix two things together, when you have these two sounds that sound a certain way by themselves, and when you play them together, the conflict of frequencies between these two sounds are as such that it will make them sound different. They will no longer have the same aural quality that they did when they were playing them by themselves. And the ultimate goal of mixing is to be able to make these two things play together and still sound like their original isolated selves. So this makes for basic, very basic ideas. Like, if you have one sound that has this huge boost in it and like this incredible, like, a lot of frequencies around the 3K area. And then this other sound, has like also a lot of 3K area. Then you kind of bring down 3K on one or both of them so that when they play together, the 3K doesn't sound like it's too much. That's just pretty basic. That's really, really basic mixing. But that's when you're making it by itself. When you're trying to make a sound the way you want it to sound by itself, phase distortion doesn't matter because it's also probably adding to what you think the sound should sound like. And again, at an individual scale, it's very difficult to kind of pick out that this is happening. Unless you do, the 300 EQ ideas. Like, part of the reason why sounds like these sound so gnarly is as a result of that effect I mentioned before, but when you're moving and you're cutting and you're boosting way too hard, you get phase distortion and also phase modulation, essentially. That happens. And it's also why when we're doing this on basses that we usually want to have a separate sub, because the sub frequency suffers the most from these things. It becomes too gnarly and not well defined. Not something I really cared about when I made this track, but this is definitely the truth. So when you're sound designing something, do whatever the hell you want with the EQ. Do whatever you think sounds dope. But when you're mixing stuff, you want to be careful. You want to be delicate. You want to ensure that you're not damaging its original sound in a way that when it's played with other things, it doesn't sound like it anymore. It doesn't sound like the way it sounds. And what's going to happen when you do this is that when you do the mixing and you do the sound designing of a sound and you put it all together in a track, if you were to listen to the element by itself, it no longer sounds the way that you thought it did. A pretty typical case of this is if you think about any guitar sound in any like heavy metal or rock song ever. What ends up happening is that we hear a guitar sound in a mix, in a full mix together, and sounds, oh, it's so loud and good. And then you try and make a guitar tone yourself that sounds like that, and you do, and it's totally great. But then you try and mix that in a song, and it's hard. It like conflicts with everything. It's so full spectrum and ridiculous. It's just how did they do this? Well, if you have to think for a second that the actual guitar tone that you were trying to match had a bass guitar beneath it, had vocals on top of it, had drums on top of it. And in all seriousness, if you listen to it by itself, it sounds pretty stupid based on what your brain was thinking it sounded like. And that's because the mixing engineer did a really good job making it sound like that kind of tone that you thought it was, making it sound like that in a mix together, because there's no way you could have that, layer in there with everything and have it actually work out. So that's exactly the purpose. That's exactly the kind of thing you have to have in mind when you're doing this sort of stuff. So when you're mixing, the way that I do this kind of thing now is I usually design sounds in Patcher. I usually have like this track. This track is a bit weird because I actually have like a wild plugin and then a patcher in the a patcher going on, and inside here. So here we have, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 EQs, and some of them are doing pretty wacky shit. And then like once that's true, I have an EQ in post. There's nothing going on. This is what I'm using for example. But like I will have I mean, I have I'll either have an EQ in post, or I'll have an EQ at the very end of the chain inside patcher. That is the one that's going to be the mixing EQ. So you see here I'm doing, you know, the not cutting so much. I'm boosting anyway because I don't give a shit. But it's still advice worth following sometimes. So that's kind of the way that I structure stuff now. Is I have everything in patchers inside as a generator, and then in the mixer insert that they're in, there'll be a post EQ that is my really careful mixing EQ. That's the way that stuff works now. Same thing with the actual master itself, which again I am boosting because I don't give a shit. But it's because again, like I'm only doing this on like 3 equalizers, you know, at the mixing stage. There wasn't really a lot of like mixing happening. I guess there wasn't plenty of that going on in some of these sounds, but some of them were just naked. I remember that. That's this guy. After a bunch of resampling. Huh. Yeah. So that was a big spiel about EQing and mixing, which I do. I apply that in the same basic way for a lot of stuff. Like what goes on in the mix for how I do all my tracks is pretty much identical. It's just what individual like low level decisions I'm making about things are tailored to whatever the content is, which is going to be different all the time. But I still have all the jobs. I still have my sidechain bus. I still have my master chain that I made after I made the first four bars of my drop, and then I have my sound design EQ, and then I have my mixing EQ, and that's really all there is to it. I'm still gonna give this giant spiel for all the rest of the tracks that I'm doing making ofs, but just in case, because you might not watch all of them. But it'll be interesting to see how it's individually applied. Anyway, if you have any questions about any of this, let me know. And as usual, have a nice day.